Shall we start? Thank you so much. I hope you had a lovely lunch. Can I just say the staff here are just so fantastic and charming, and it's just been lovely to have such lovely people serving coffee and tea and all the rest. So we're going to enter a lovely session now. Always, anything to do with salmon, it's always going to be a little bit sad and upsetting, but fundamentally positive and looking at what can be done and the inspiration we can take from that. And of course, the freshwater environment is where we hope we have maximum control. And we heard earlier yesterday from Professor Dieter Helm about the potential of catchment scale restoration, rather. So we'll look a little bit about that. And the issues across different regions, the unique chalk stream rivers, and a good news story at the end showing that freshwaters can be safeguarded for wild salmon, and of course where you safeguard it for wild salmon, you safeguard it for other species as well. So I'm really delighted to introduce the next two guests. We have no chalk streams in Ireland, but I went on holiday in West Sussex, and I was absolutely enamored by one I came across, so I'm really interested in this next session. From Alison Matthews and Jim Murray. You saw Jim's beautiful film earlier. Alison is from the Rivers Trust. She's the Chalk Stream Programme Manager, focusing on rivers and streams that originate from underground water in chalk bedrock and known for their clear, pure water. And Jim is an artist, a river conservationist, and an actor on both sides of the Atlantic. And for the past 15 years, he's been working so hard to be the voice of the environment. He also co-runs the Murray Parish Trust in honour of his late daughter, Ella Jane, and he leads the activists, anglers movement. So I'm going to hand you now over to Alison and Jim.
Hi, good afternoon. It's fantastic to be able to come and share with you the passion that Jim and I have for our chalk streams. Been blown away by hearing about so much of what's going on through other parts of the world and the rivers that you have that are special to you. We want to tell you about rivers that are special to us. So I'm going to start with a bit of an explanation about what chalk streams are, because many of you, as we've just heard, come from places you don't have the benefit of these wonderful rivers. So the chalk rock is shown here on my map in green. So it goes through most of England from sort of southwest Dorset up to north of London, into East Anglia, and then on up into Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, where we have our most northerly chalk streams. You're probably familiar with the picture there of the chalk. It's a bit like the White Cliffs of Dover. So for those who don't know chalk quite as intimately as I do, as a programme manager for chalk streams, it's a fine-grained white limestone type of rock, and it has lots of fissures and holes in it through which water is transmitted. So if you live in one of these areas where you see this green shading, if it rains, then there's a good chance the water's going to soak into the chalk, flow through it, it will be purified as it goes, filtered, cleaned up, and then it will emerge as a chalk stream or a chalk spring. And these are obviously the rivers you can see on my map behind me. So what's important about that is that the groundwater really buffers what happens to the flow in these rivers. So I thoroughly enjoyed Jason's presentation right at the start, and he showed the pictures of the floods and the droughts. You do get floods and droughts in chalk streams, but they're nothing like what he showed. It's a very gentle environment, a very sort of benign, good-tempered stream, really. So they don't have big flood flows, they don't have droughts. That doesn't mean that they don't have their impact, but it's not the same dramatic effect. They've been massively useful to people for as long as time begins. So they've been used for clean water, many settlements have grown up around them. And of course, for wildlife, they are incredible. They're one of the most biodiverse ecosystems that we have in our river system, supporting a whole range of species and habitats in them. And I should say, I can't believe I almost forgot, because most of you might not know about chalk streams, 85% of the world's chalk streams are actually in England. So we have a global responsibility to look after them and make sure that they're protected for future generations and for the wildlife that live in them. So what makes them great for salmon? Well, it's a good starting point, really. This chalk groundwater that comes out of the aquifer at a fairly constant 10 degrees. So we've heard about rivers warming up, we've heard about climate change. Chalk streams have the benefit of having water that's coming out. It's relatively warm in the winter, it's cool in the summer. That's a great starting point for your cool, clean rivers that we're aiming for. You can see from the picture there, they're also clean. They're very pure, clean water. So if you're a salmon and you're thinking about the salmon life cycle, They have wonderful gravel beds into which they can cut their redds, lay their eggs, and then for the eggs to develop. And the groundwater's all the time coming up and bubbling through the gravels. So you have this wonderful, clear, clean water bubbling up through the gravels, providing perfect incubation for those eggs. And then as they get older and they move off into the surrounding habitats, there's a mosaic of habitats within chalk streams, or a good chalk stream, into which those smolts can develop. And I learned whilst reading, I'm not a salmon scientist, I hate to admit, and I've learned that apparently in chalk streams, smolts often go out to sea after a year because they can grow so quickly and so well in a chalk stream because it has such great biodiversity. So where do you find them? The map over there shows the principal salmon rivers in the UK. You may have seen something like it already before. And the red ring highlights the chalk streams that have salmon in them. And recent research has shown that those salmon in those chalk streams are genetically unique. They've adapted over millennia to live in those rivers. They're quite different from other salmon. So the salmon that live in the far west there, in Devon and Cornwall, they're more similar to French salmon than they are to the ones next to them in the chalk streams there. And I guess one of the questions you might be asking yourself is, if I'm telling you that chalk streams are so wonderful, and they are, then why does that map look like it does? Why have we not got any principal salmon rivers on the east coast, further over into Kent, up through London? Why are they only those few rivers there? And if they're so great, why are the salmon in those rivers really not doing very well? This slide shows some of the pressures that, let's face it, most of our rivers are under. So I'm just going to pick out the things that maybe are most relevant for chalk streams. So the picture at the top right, you might recognise the red London buses. We have chalk streams in London. They're wonderful, but they're built right up to. It's a pretty tough environment to survive in there. And those people are using an awful lot of water, and then that water's being used and being put back into the environment, obviously not as clean as it was when it started. So there's concerns about nutrients. There's also concerns about forever chemicals and microplastics getting into the water system and from there into the salmon, which affects them. There's also this nasty-looking slide of dirty water coming off a field and onto a road. That's a combination of bad things for chalk streams. Intensification of agriculture means that sediment runoff is more prevalent than it was before. Highways provide a perfect pathway for taking it and any other things that happen to be on them down into our rivers. That's a real problem. But probably the top left is probably our biggest concern about chalk stream salmon. It's the barriers that there are to their migration. And you've heard about that before. So that in itself might not be anything new. But I was struck by the presentation earlier about the Magna Carta, because some people have linked the fact that there are no salmon in the chalk streams in the east to the predominance of mills that there were put in the medieval times even, and that has blocked the salmon from getting into those chalk streams in other places. That's what the thinking is. So it does go back a long time, our impact on chalk streams. And the middle picture is really meant to denote climate change. We've talked about that enough, so you're well aware of the risks of climate change. They equally apply to chalk streams. But of course, chalk streams have this benefit of naturally being quite cool, which is a good thing. And to remind myself, estuaries, I think we tend to fall into this trap of being river managers, or we're worried about things happening out at sea. And I was really pleased to hear lots of people talk about that transition area in the estuaries. This is the Itchen estuary in Hampshire, and our chalk streams along that sort of southerly band. These estuaries are really busy places. They're noisy, they're busy, they're warm, they're complicated environments, really difficult for the salmon to navigate their way back up through those estuaries and find their river again. So what can we do? A lot of presentations have followed this model, haven't we? We've talked about the problem, we've talked about what we can do. So it seems a logical approach, doesn't it? So my role at the Rivers Trust is to manage the delivery of the chalk stream restoration strategy. It's called the CABA Chalk Stream Restoration Strategy, and that's important. It's part of the catchment-based approach. So at Rivers Trust, we're really good at working with our member Rivers Trusts, there are over 60 of them, and working with people in catchments to make sure that we use the local knowledge and expertise, and we deliver solutions that work for those local rivers. Talking about the Native Americans having real value on their rivers, I tell you, the people of Hampshire and Dorset, they're the same sort of thought process behind them. They really love their rivers, they care for them, and they want to be involved in protecting them for the future. So the delivery of the restoration strategy is a series of actions, practical actions, that we can deliver with our partners to make things better for chalk streams. That will make things better for all of the nature of the chalk streams as well as the salmon. And potentially, if we get it right, we can make a bigger group of chalk rivers that can act as habitat for even more chalk stream. So there's a real opportunity here to do more. So I should also say that there's a great example recently I'll just very briefly talk about in the Itchen, my home river. So 133 salmon came back to the Itchen in 2022. That's nothing like the thousands we heard about earlier in these big river systems. They've probably only got to swim about 10 or 20k. Again, nothing like what we heard about earlier. But they're really important. Every salmon is important. And so given the low number, a group of people came together in the catchment to take practical action that could be delivered now. They recognise the urgency of the situation. They want to address it. And that's groups of people that span across fisheries, land managers, farmers, water companies, regulators, the Rivers Trust, all of those people wanting to deliver practical action on the ground. And just a really quick example of data and use of data. A really dedicated fishery scientist in the Environment Agency produced a marvellous report looking particularly at the risk of a wastewater treatment works on the Itchen estuary and the impact it was having on salmon. He did a really great report which really demonstrated why it was such a big risk to salmon in terms of reducing dissolved oxygen, increasing temperature and high levels of ammonia, coupled with the hostile sort of day in, day out tidal movements. And that has triggered Southern Water to invest millions in upgrading a wastewater treatment work that wouldn't have been upgraded until later on. So using data and evidence, collecting data and evidence is great, use it to make things happen. And that's a really great example, I think. But if I talk to those people, they'll tell you they want to do more. They want more pace, more urgency, more ambition. They want to really improve things, and that's what Jim's going to talk to you about in a minute. There's also plenty of people out there, citizen scientists, engaged in their river, collecting data. And as Chalk Stream Programme Manager, I come across this a lot, where people are learning more about where the threats to their rivers are. And what I'm trying to do in the work I do is take that information and target it to make sure that we're taking action in the right places. Lobby decision makers, I left that one till last. This one's a bit of a tricky one for me. I come from a background as a regulator where we didn't lobby government, so this is a new thing for me. I've been in this role for less than a year. We produced a recovery pack which explained to the government what needed to happen to protect chalk streams, and sadly, they've not adopted it and they've not taken it forward. I don't know whether Daniel Zein is here yet, but I'd really love to talk to him about how we can maybe work together to take forward some of the things in there. So we could do with some more support from government for chalk streams, and there's always the issue of needing to have funding for catchment-based work, which we need to secure as well. So I think I just finished by saying Rivers Trust are really proud to be part of the Missing Salmon Alliance. We've got a lot of experience to bring to that group, and Jim's going to talk to us now about how we could look towards saving the chalk stream salmon. Oops.
Well done, lovely. Can I get some slides, please? Thank you. So this incredible chalk aquifer that Alison has just introduced to you has sheltered the salmon in Britain for some 2 million years, making it possibly the oldest living species in this country, creating the conditions for a distinct race of fish that found a home here and never left. That is why it's such an important fish, why it's so genetically unique, and why we have to save it. If the Atlantic salmon is the country's endangered species, then the chalk stream salmon is critically endangered. It is the UK's white rhino. That's how important it is. Once this strain has gone, possibly the oldest Atlantic salmon strain we have in the Atlantic basin, once it's gone, and that's it. And as Alison said, my home rivers too, the Test and the Itchen, flagship chalk streams, should be abundant with thousands of these fish. Used to be. 300 came over the counter on the river Test last year, 130 odd on the Itchen. Unsustainable. So what can we do? Well, we know as recently as 50 years ago, the percentage of smolt that went out to sea and returned as adult salmon was roughly 12% on the chalk streams. Nowadays, it's closer to 3%. So it's a numbers game. We have to turn these chalk streams into juvenile salmon factories. We have to produce thousands upon thousands of fat young par that become big, strong smolt that we can send out to sea en masse as an army to take on the challenges that the ocean throws at them. That's what we need to do. How are we going to do that? Well, you've heard about rewilding catchments. Some people find that term pretty polarizing. What we mean by that on the chalk streams is reconnecting the chalk rivers to the floodlands, to the woodlands, to the fens, to the springs, to the meanders that they've been isolated from for hundreds and hundreds of years. It means chopping out the canalized, dredged, homogenized, unfixable sections of those rivers and reconnecting them with ribbons of beautiful rivers that open up the catchment to every inch for spawning grounds and nurseries, so that we can give these salmon the best chance possible to create as many par as we can. And if, God forbid, the Environment Agency lets us, we can start stocking some of these revitalized, flourish uplands. And I'm not talking about hatcheries. We know that they don't necessarily perform that well, which is where the EA's head is at the moment. We're talking about taking eggs from a couple of prime specimens and creating artificial reds so that when, God forbid, we can get those highways reopened for those diminishing salmon runs, they've got somewhere to go to breed. And for those of you who balk at the idea of us messing with nature when it comes to the salmon, may I suggest I think that ship has already sailed and there is no time like the present, especially when it comes to this particular strain of fish. And if, given the stage, I can just talk to you very briefly about government, about the EA. As Alison has said, there is a fantastic ready-made chalk stream recovery pack waiting to go, written by the Mr. Chalkstream himself, Charles Rangeley Wilson. That's been shelved by the new government in their brilliance. So that needs to change. And I'm not having a pop at the EA, not, the soldiers, the boots on the ground, those officers are fantastic. Those lions led by donkeys. They are doing so much with so little backing. My crosshairs aim firmly at the apathetic, indifferent, short-term careerists in Whitehall. I'm talking about Steve Reed and Keir Starmer. I'm talking about Mary Goujon earlier, who have spoon-fed us bullshit so that they can scalp our votes. Yeah? Overpromised and undelivered regularly, just like the last lot. That needs to change. It is on their watch. They will preside over the acute demise of the wild salmon. Rant over. So, it's up to us. It's up to the people. Thank you. Thank you. It's up to us. It's up to the people, the true stakeholders of our rivers. And that's why I'm pleased to share with you today an ambitious idea I'm part of that's currently gathering pace, involving a long-term 25-year project, a nuts and bolts chalk stream salmon recovery plan on my local rivers, the Test and the Itchen. Project Whiteheart is in the final stages of development. A galvanized partnership between the Atlantic Salmon Trust, CABA, the Rivers Trust, Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, Fish Legal, Hampshire Riverkeepers Association, Test and Itchen Association, Southern Water. Yes, Southern Water, as Alison says, it is way overdue that polluters make meaningful reparations for the mess that they've caused. And aquaculture, take heed. The current patronizing pittance you offer compared to your vulgar profiteering for the damage you do is unforgivable. Thank you. Back to Whiteheart. So NGOs, riparian owners, fisheries, anyone and everyone who has a passion or vested interest in the Test and Itchen rivers. And this collegiate effort will draw upon the nuanced expertise of all these like-minded groups by firstly implementing a scrupulous audit on those rivers, identifying and prioritizing the major pinch points for salmon, followed by a catchment-centric master plan to make those rivers strongholds once again for the mighty chalk stream salmon. A pioneering 25-year project that, if successful, this massive collective effort should prove to be a standard bearer for all our precious chalk streams, a blueprint not just for the Wessex Basin, but for the chalk streams of Yorkshire, Norfolk, Kent, France, Denmark, and indeed perhaps set an example to all polluters. And dare I say it, the beleaguered Environment Agency to start investing properly into our rivers and the future of their wild fish stock. Chalk streams are purpose-built by nature to offer the salmon sanctuary in an ever-changing world. The most meaningful action we can take is creating amazing habitat and the means for salmon to get to it, in the Wessex Stronghold and then all chalk streams. For these rivers could be an ark for English salmon, because their unique and stable habitats will still be viable salmonid rivers, even under climate change scenarios when other rivers may well be uninhabitable. They're so important, these rivers. I wouldn't be up here unless I believed in that. With the governing factors clearly being out at sea and common to all salmon runs, we need action that delivers more smolt per returning fish. That is it, it's that simple. And it is paramount that initiatives such as Project Whiteheart, as a maximum group effort, be rolled out across the land and greenlit with immediate effect if we're to make a difference, if we're to bring back our white rhino, the profoundly precious, the desperately threatened chalk stream salmon. Look, the late, great, the salmon don himself, Ori Vigvason, showed us how vision, passion, and initiative can turn disaster around. Let's honor his legacy by uniting in our common cause. Because salmon don't care about egos, logos, or silos. We need to work together. We know we can't trust our governments to do their jobs. We need to take a leap into the breach, to collaborate, to cooperate, and we need to do it now. Thank you very much.
We need to do it now. Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you so much, Alison, for that incredibly inspiring set of talks. We're going to move on to hydropower and wild Atlantic salmon in Norwegian rivers. I am fully aware of Brexit, but for those of you who are interested, damremoval.eu are an amazing group, and they have been pulling down dams, and you can see some phenomenal examples on their website of what happens within days in terms of salmon returning to rivers when weirs and dams are pulled down. Torfinn Evensen is General Secretary of Norwegian Salmon Rivers, Oslo in Norway, where his main aim is the conservation and enhancement of salmon stocks and to increase the politicians' awareness of the vulnerability of wild salmon. He's going to speak now.
Dear all wild salmon friends, good afternoon. I brought one of them missing from Norwegian summer last year, so it can get together to the rest of the Missing Salmon Alliance. I would thank the Missing Salmon Alliance for inviting us to this very important conference. And this presentation will focus on the challenges posed by certain processes, practices, and the solutions that can cause both hydropower and sustainability and survival of wild salmon. You see the painting from the river Drammen back in the old days and today. Of course, that dam effect on the number of salmon and the survival of the wild salmon in that river. A country responsible for over 1/3 of the Atlantic salmon, Norway holds a unique position to safeguard the vulnerable species. There are 450 salmon rivers in Norway, which 1/3 are affected by hydropower plants. And we have 52 designated national salmon rivers, so we hope they got some protection. Over the last 40 years, the number of returning salmon has declined by a staggering 70%. Wild salmon, an emblem of our ecological and cultural heritage, is currently at the tipping point. Why are river face so important now? It's because of the threats at sea from aquaculture industry, for instance. Therefore, we need healthy rivers systems producing as many smolts as possible. Hydropower is a major contributor to Norwegian energy mix, but it comes to a significant cost, as you see. The effects are multifaceted. First, no water, no fish, this is obvious. Hydropower often diverts and disrupts water flows, leaving salmon habitats without the necessary conditions to survive. And second, barriers to migration. Hydropower dams obstruct both upstreams and downstreams migration, crucial for the salmon life cycle. Third, the mortality through turbines. When smolt migrate downstream, passing through turbines increase the mortality rates. And fourth, loss of natural flow and temperature regimes, as we heard before this day. Altering these natural conditions disrupt the delicate balance needed for thriving ecosystems. And at last, flooding reduction, a lack of these natural conditions, a lack of natural flooding destroys shelters essential for young salmons. The result is river environment that no longer support the natural processes wild salmon depend on. The current situation underscores the urgency of implementing solutions to mitigate these impacts. Hydropower doesn't have to come at the expense of wild salmon. With appropriate measures, it can be green and sustainable. Some key solutions include two-way migration solutions, establishing fish ladders and bypass systems to allow salmon to migrate safely both up and downstream. Environmentally adapted water flow patterns, minimizing natural water level and flow conditions. Avoiding hydropower outlets to river, balancing the power grid. This can minimize stress of river systems. And habitat protection and improvements, ensuring rivers are restored and protected from further development. There's one example for one bypass system in Norway, recently introduced. It could be copied in different other rivers. Revision of operating terms for hydropower licenses present a golden opportunity. Adjustments must address water temperature, flow conditions, hydropeaking, and implement environmental design strategies, including bottleneck analysis. Climate change adds complexity, but also offers opportunities. Increased precipitation could mean more water both to hydropower and salmon habitats. By prioritizing natural flooding processes, we can create a win-win scenario. And what could we as NGO do? NGOs play a vital role in addressing these challenging problems. We can, one, raise awareness by bringing hydropower impact on salmon into public and political discourse. Second, political advocacy by influencing decision-making to prioritize ecological conditions. And third, promoting research by supporting studies that guide better management practices. And fourth, acting as consultants by contributing expertise during licenses revision processes. On the financial side, Norwegian Salmon River propose a practical funding model by adding a small surcharge of 0.01 Norwegian kroner per kilowatt hour of hydropower produced. An annual fund of approximately £100 million could be established. This fund will be sufficient to restore more of the damage to river ecosystem, benefiting both salmon rivers and others. Such a model draws inspiration from successful initiatives like Innova, a governmental fund which protects environmentally friendly energy solutions. This approach is not only feasible, but also aligns with Norwegian's broader environmental goals. So, in conclusion, the coexistence of hydropower and wild salmon is possible, but it requires immediate action. Hydropower must evolve to include environmentally sustainable practices that prioritize the health of the salmon populations. By leveraging innovative solutions, revising licenses terms, and creating dedicated funding mechanisms, we can protect the valuable and vulnerable species while maintaining Norwegian energy needs. Wild salmon survival depends on the choices we make today. Let's commit to ensuring that future generations can experience the thriving ecosystems that define our rivers. But there is an urgent need for political action. So we all have to do something now and quick. Thank you.
Thank you, Torfinn. Thank you, Torfinn. I feel like if there was a word cloud for all the talks, the main word would be urgent, followed by now. We heard yesterday from Professor Sir Dieter Helm about the catchment approach and the idea of a catchment systems operator who could wield the power to adapt the kind of siloed funding into genuine delivery in a way that's effective, urgent, and at the scale that is needed. And we're going to hear a little bit more about the whole catchment approach in the face of climate change from our next speaker, Dr. Lorraine Hawkins from the D District Salmon Fisheries Board. She is the river director there, and she has a scientific background in fish ecology. She's a chartered environmentalist for her work in wild salmon fisheries management as well.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ella. So I'm part of the non-Scottish contingent that's come down from Scotland. I'll be speaking to you about the Aberdeenshire River Dee, our river. So here it is. It's one of Scotland's larger rivers. It's about 120 kilometres in length. And the catchment-based approach I'll be talking about is, for the large part, focused on the Upper Dee catchment, which is approximately 1,000 kilometres squared. Most of that lies within the Cairngorms National Park, so it's a pretty mountainous upper catchment, and it flows into arable lowlands, and really not much in the way of urban areas until we get to the city of Aberdeen on the coast. So we made national news back at the end of 2015, unfortunately, due to severe flooding caused by heavy rains associated with Storm Frank. The human impact of that flood was huge. Obviously, how homes and businesses were flooded, and the beautiful village of Ballater became infamous with static caravans floating down the river. But what we've seen is the long-term impact on the local communities, who are genuinely fearful now every time the rivers rise. And there's still a lot of debate about what is the best solution for protecting those communities going forward. Now, it was classified as a 1 in 500 flood event, but since then we've had 2 similar flood events, just slightly smaller. So it does appear that we may need to recalibrate our classification based on the current conditions. The impact of floods, as well as droughts, sort of implemented in being the major factor for the decline of our freshwater pearl mussel population on the Dee. In just 20 years, from 2002 until 2022, we've seen a decline of this endangered species of 89% on the River Dee. It's not just floods and drought, we're also seeing our water temperatures rising in the summer. They're possibly getting cooler in the winter as well, because of the loss of snow cover means that loss of an insulating layer for our mountain streams. But this is bad news for some of our aquatic invertebrates. We've seen and predicted to see changes as a result of these temperature changes. So, for example, this is a picture of an alpine mayfly species that we get in the Dee, and that's already been shown to be contracting its range in one of our upper Dee tributaries. So these are really quite clear examples of how climate change is affecting our upper catchment. But it's also made worse by the interactions with land uses. Now, land uses have been having an impact for hundreds of years, but we're really just starting to feel the impact of those now when they interact with the climate change. And there's no real single solution for this. It does take a catchment approach because it's large-scale impacts that we're dealing with. And for us, we've brought this all together under Atlantic salmon, a keystone species. It's one that we would used to refer to, or still do refer to, as the canary in the mine. It is a good indicator for all those issues that we're seeing on the river. Atlantic salmon, you know, are impacted by climate changes, and they're impacted by the land use changes as well. On our catchment, it's particularly the loss of riverbank woodlands, the overgrazing of the uplands, and the arable runoff. They're our big pressures. And just as a single statistic that sort of encompasses that, we've seen an 80% decline in our upper catchment salmon since the 1970s. So I think that figure pretty much reflects what so many other people have been talking about from other systems as well. It's all bad news so far. What are we going to do? Well, we've begun an ambitious 20-year programme of work called Save the Spring to deliver this catchment-based approach. It's a partnership between the charitable River Dee Trust, the statutory Dee District Salmon Fishery Board, and the Atlantic Salmon Trust, also supported by the partners, the University of Stirling and the University of Highlands and Islands. Now, the name Save the Spring refers to the climate changes that are impacting on the upper catchment. It also refers to our spring salmon subpopulation, which largely hails from the upper D catchment. Once upon a time, we believed that the upper D had the biggest, or the D had the biggest spring salmon fishery in the world, but it has seen the greatest decline and is now more at risk of extinction. So, Save the Spring is taking a two-pronged approach. That first prong which is the real focus, is about creating resilience in the upper D catchment. So it's not necessarily restoring to what it was, but just making sure that natural river processes can operate so that it can adapt to future challenges. So our first step in developing catchment restoration is to develop a restoration plan, or as Jim Murray said, I like the term master plan. So we're pulling that together right now so that it prioritizes our areas for delivery, and it also allows us to set baselines from which we can monitor progress from. Now, the key challenge for us on the D is getting the buy-in from stakeholders, particularly those most associated with the land. So the landowners and also the factors and the land managers and the keepers who work the land. The benefit of having this sort of overarching plan is it allows those stakeholders and those individuals to see where they fit in to helping to deliver that big objective. So in terms of actually the tools we've got to make our catchment resilient, well, the key tool for us is riverbank tree planting, which we've been doing for about the last 12 years. For us, it's primarily to create shade to reduce water temperatures, but as you probably know, there are a huge number of benefits from planting trees, including just the general habitat improvement and benefits for wider biodiversity. In terms of other tools that we've got, we're looking at reconnecting floodplains, developing wetlands, restoring former flood channels, and in-stream work such as large woody structures and debris dams. And again, we've been using these tools already for several years now, but the focus of this approach is that the plan allows us to move from that opportunistic approach that we were taking to a much more strategic approach where we can actually quantify what each of these tools will deliver us and then make good decisions about what we do, when we do it, and when we prioritize it. I said this is a two-pronged strategy. So the second prong is wild fish repopulation. So this is being targeted at localized areas within our catchment where the salmon subpopulations have already reached critically low population numbers. So we've been looking at a good example of this type of work being done across the Atlantic in the Bay of Fundy, and we're now developing our own methods and processes so that we can carry out smolt to adult supplementation, a tool that's a form of conservation translocation. So this is very much being done with the University of Stirling, and we're developing methods and really trying to work out the technicalities so that we can collect smolts from the wild, rear them in captivity until they're adults, and then release them back in the river as adults to spawn naturally. So the overall plan is to have minimal intervention, for it to be time limited, and for the purpose of being to ensure there's no genetic loss so that we do maintain that genetic pool from which we can rebuild from. Just briefly to say that monitoring is really critical to this program to show the effectiveness of the methods. The goal is to gather data on habitat conditions, on salmon populations, including genetics, and on the overall health of the river ecosystem, as well as monitoring the actual program of work per se, and including a social science perspective in that. So showing how we could deliver this two-pronged approach effectively.
So that's large-scale catchment restoration combined with the wild fish repopulation can help us develop best practice strategies that we would hope would be useful for other rivers as well. Sorry. There we are. So I've mentioned stakeholders. Really, they are absolutely key to the success of this program. We need to raise awareness with them, and we really need to get their support. Now, in terms of local communities and the general public, we've been doing a number of things already to sort of incorporate them into this work, including sort of hosting events, visits such as walk and talks to our restoration sites. We run an education program with school groups and other community groups, and a whole heap of digital communication as well. And then we've got the more focused key stakeholder groups that we're also developing engagement strategies with. So this year we're starting a series of technical workshops. We have an international scientific advisory group that's set up to help guide the program. We feed back and discuss with Scottish Government's Science and Evidence Board about this work, and we will be developing a communication strategy focused at policymakers and politicians. All of this to ensure a significant program legacy. So to date, in Scotland, Scottish Government grants have funded quite a lot of nature restoration work, in particular woodland creation and peatland restoration, and we've certainly tapped into that for much of the work that we've done so far. But as we scale up, and as others scale up as well, there's clearly not enough public funding available. In fact, Scottish Government have said that there's a £20 billion financing gap for nature in Scotland over the next decade. So we've therefore been looking at other funding sources as well. So we've been really developing philanthropic funding, in particular from grant-giving benefactors, but also from individual donors and fundraising events and campaigns. For example, we have a 1 million trees campaign. We've also been developing our relationships with corporate groups, with financing sort of quite likely coming through their ESG or CSR routes for those. And in particular, I will give mention to BP, who have supported this program and really enabled it to be launched a year ago. So that their support was really fundamental in building capacity for this work. So our funding mix so far has been fairly successful, but as we look to the future, we are thinking more strategically about green financing so that we can ensure that we deliver to the scale of the task that we've got. So I'm certainly hoping that greater minds than mine who will be in this room will be able to develop solutions for us. And this is also now a shameless plug for anybody interested in supporting Save the Spring to please get in touch with us. My final slide. So this first year, we've really focused on setting up the framework for this program, but we have always also wanted to make some early progress. So just a few sort of insights or early learnings. In terms of the technical operations, well, we've started on the smolt to adult supplementation work, as well as the catchment audit, which will feed into the restoration plan. And we're really feeding the learnings as we go along and seeking advice through avenues such as those technical working groups and the scientific advisory group. We've also made an early focus on developing sort of good collaborative relationships with universities, and that's already leading to some really productive working. In terms of collaboration and consultations, well, with any large catchment scale approach, there's multiple stakeholders that you need to engage, from water suppliers, regulators, community groups, conservation groups, etc., etc. We find we've got common ground with just about everyone. So there is a balance to be struck between keeping all of those groups engaged, but remaining focused on our own goals as well. Finally, with stakeholder engagement, well, this program has needed to sort of engage at the local, the national, and the international level. And you've probably heard many people say it's always important to get those people engaged from the outset of the work. That's really the key to any success. So I really hope that is how we have started this program. And then just finally to say scale and ambition is really key to the program. There isn't really much point unless we can make a meaningful difference at this late stage for our Atlantic salmon. So it does seem very fitting that if we can restore an ecologically and culturally keystone species, that would be a good marker to show success. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. I was so happy to hear mention of the freshwater pearl mussel, my favourite thing. Of course, in lockstep with the salmon, because if they go, freshwater pearl mussel will go rapidly as well. We still have a little bit of a population in Ireland remaining. I'm delighted now to introduce our final speaker before the break for some inspiration, and it is Nathan Wilbur of the Atlantic Salmon Federation to talk about the Canadian North, a global stronghold for Atlantic salmon. He is the Vice President of Regional Programs for the Atlantic Salmon Federation in Canada, and he manages their conservation programs throughout Eastern Canada, and he's got a very interesting background in engineering. Nathan.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Well, I've got the unique role today to tell you about something positive, a bright spot in salmon country, which is the Canadian North, and we call it a global Atlantic salmon stronghold. Hopefully you leave here today after this talk feeling a little bit better about yourselves and hopefully even inspired that there is hope for the species that we all love. My talk will focus on the North American side of things, obviously by the title. I'll give you a little bit of context around the state of health. We heard from Mr. Walker yesterday about the overall state of health of Atlantic salmon populations. I'll take a little deeper dive into the North American side, and then talk about a program that we're embarking on in an effort to try to create a resilient future for Atlantic salmon in North America. My talk will focus heavily on imagery, and I do have a video at the end. And I took that approach, just everybody loves images. It's the afternoon, we've seen lots of numbers. I will have some numbers, but I'll focus heavily on imagery, and we work closely with wildlife photographer, videographer Nick Hawkins, who does excellent work with Atlantic salmon. So we know this map well. It's the migration route of Atlantic salmon from both Europe and North America, showing the feeding grounds in Greenland and the migration patterns. And just bring this up to show you sort of at the macro scale, the area I'll be focusing my talk on, which is the North American side, and in particular, in that red box, in particular, the northern half of that red box. So in that red box, in the range of Atlantic salmon in North America, we have the full spectrum of health. We have all the issues that you deal with in the UK and Norway, and Europe, from heavily developed human-impacted areas, industrial areas like this picture you see on the left from the Penobscot in Maine. This is actually a picture of a major dam removal on the Penobscot back in 2012. And then on the right, it's a picture from Labrador, the Pinware River in Labrador, which is at the other end of the spectrum, which is essentially an untouched, pristine watershed, with the exception of a couple of cabins. It has no human development. So if we look, if we consider the information that the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas has published, there's a clear north-south gradient of health in North America, and I just sketched a dotted red line on there to show that around halfway through New Brunswick, a line sort of traveling through Cape Breton, south of that line, populations are really struggling. North of that line, populations are generally relatively healthy, and in some cases very healthy. So there's a clear north-south gradient of health here. It's important to keep that in mind. The southern regions are obviously the most impacted by people, also by climate change, warming waters, all of the issues associated with that. And the northern range is as you get further and further north, it gets more and more pristine. Here's a slide, a map that shows fisheries, and I mainly show this. I would like you to have a look at the North American range through the lens of fisheries, just to see how many rivers that we have. We have approximately 1,100 rivers, which historically have all supported fisheries, both recreational and indigenous food fisheries. This slide shows recreational fisheries, but the same slide could be shown for indigenous food, social, and ceremonial fisheries. In the south, most of those fisheries are long closed, which we think is a real tragedy because it severs the connection between people and salmon and people and rivers. And then you can see sort of in the mid part of the range, there's catch and release fisheries, so people can still connect, but through catch and release, limited impact fishery. And then as you move north, angling opportunities increase, and the same is true with the indigenous fisheries. I'd like to focus in particularly on this region called Labrador. This area is healthy and getting even healthier. It's at about 360% of its established conservation limit reference point. And as the climate warms, this area actually has benefited. In 2023, it had a 92% increase in large spawners compared to the previous 5-year average. And that sounds awfully good to me when we think about all of the declines in the other parts of the Atlantic salmon world. So it's a real bright spot for Atlantic salmon. Now that said, the regions south of there are all showing declines. With the exception of Maine, interestingly, at the very far southern part of the range, Maine's actually shown an increase, and that's because collectively we're doing the right things there by taking out dams and restoring ecosystems. I'd like to look at the last 30 years of returns in North America overall. The dark green line shows large spawners, and the lighter green line shows grills, and the black line is combined. And since the early 90s, we've actually had over a 30% increase in our returns of Atlantic salmon in North America. Now, the caveat to that is that that's being driven by Labrador, essentially. It's being driven by that northern region. All the other southern regions, all the other regions south of that are in pretty rough shape. So keep that in mind. But I do want to, this is the only region, if we think about Norway, the UK, Europe, this is the only region that actually has a long-term increasing trend. Now, I purposely cut off the time series prior to the early 90s, which was much higher, and there was a shift in marine productivity around the late 80s, early 90s, as we know, and everything dropped down. But I think it's important to show that we have been on a 30-year positive trend. And I think that can leave us with some positivity. So what does healthy look like? We think it looks like this. If you think of that water drop that falls onto the landscape and it hits the vegetation, percolates down through the soil, and is released slowly into the river as cold, clean water. We say cold, clean water all the time, and I've been hearing that as a common theme here. So this is a watershed on the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, and very low impact from people. There is a little bit of forestry, but as you can see, a very healthy looking landscape. Going a little further north, here's the Pinware River in Labrador, and again, this river has very, very low impact from people and produces cold, clean water. Down in New Brunswick, here's the headwaters of the Miramichi system. The Miramichi has historically been the largest producing salmon river in eastern North America. Here's a headwaters section that's relatively healthy. We call this the alder grounds. You can see the channel meandering. It has lots of room to sort of meander through the landscape. Here's the Bonaventure River in Quebec, which is fed high in the mountains from its sources, and there's a limestone geology here, so it's quite beautiful water. And even in the warmest times of the warmest summers, the Bonaventure still runs cold. Going way up to the northern part of salmon country, here's a river in northern Labrador, and it's called the Hunt River, and essentially no human impacts whatsoever. You can see the riparian zone has wetlands, and it's treed in some places. It's a very healthy system. Here's the Patapedia River in Quebec in the Gaspé Peninsula. Now the Patapedia has one of the largest protected areas in its watershed in the Gaspé Peninsula, and as a result, cold, clean water. Here's the Adlatuck in Labrador, a beautiful setting. Here's the Hunt River again, and when I look at this picture, I think back about yesterday's presentation about the Rhine, where they showed that painting from, what was it, 400 years ago or something like that, or a couple hundred years ago, with that beautiful landscape and the islands in the river, and then fast forward to today where it's channelized and built up. And I think about that when I look at this and think that this is the good old days. We have the good old days right now. Let's make sure we keep it that way in Labrador. Here's the York River on the Gaspé Peninsula. I guess what would be considered a chalk stream is limestone base, very beautiful, relatively healthy wild salmon population. And I'll take you underwater. Nick Hawkins did an amazing job capturing some underwater shots of wild salmon. These are all from the Gaspé Peninsula, where we have a limestone geology, so the rivers are incredibly clear. This picture is pretty unique in that it's taken under the ice. Nick was capturing some spawning footage and had a particularly cold few days, and the river actually froze, and he didn't let that hold him back, so he got right in there and was a little uncomfortable when he found himself under the ice with a beaver, though, at one point. Here's the moment of truth. And this last picture, I do have a few more slides, but this last picture in my series here is the only one that includes people. And I wanted to end it on this one because at ASF we think we believe strongly that what healthy looks like for Atlantic salmon includes people. It takes people who care. Here you have a family looking out over some anglers, and these are all people who care about the river and the salmon. And we have a lot of people across both sides of the Atlantic that care deeply about Atlantic salmon, and we want to continue fostering that connection. So how do we keep these places wild and healthy? In the north, in Canada, we're starting with a full tank. So thankfully, our Canadian government committed to the international movement to protect 30% of land and water by 2030. And we're about halfway there in Canada. We've been involved fairly heavily in pushing for protections in Atlantic salmon country. We've been somewhat successful in that. There's a lot more opportunity there with this other 15% to protect more wild salmon country. So we're trying for that. Getting protections is hard, as you all know. There's competing interests across the landscape. There's industry, there's stakeholders, there's rights holders, there's landowners, there's mining rights. It's hard, but it's also hard to change the way that a sewage treatment plant discharges their effluent, like we heard about yesterday from the UK. It's also hard to restore a riparian zone. It's hard to do everything that salmon need us to do, and if, at least in this particular situation, we're starting with a full tank and we can focus on trying to keep it that way. So we've got a new program over the last couple of years that we're developing and focusing on priority places throughout the northern part of the North American range. It's a program focused on safeguarding watersheds, creating a network of climate resilient watersheds where people are engaged and local leaders from Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities work together to drive what they want to see in their watershed 100 years into the future, or 7 generations. Not 1 or 2 or 5 years, but what's a vision for 100 years. So we've got a few of these watersheds kicked off already. We'll be looking at things like landscape protections, but also carrying out some climate-focused research to look at resilience and how can we get ahead of some of the issues that we know are coming and that the southern part of the range has already experienced. What can we do now to keep these places healthy? And mobilizing people who care, fostering a vibrant connection between people and salmon. We think that's so important, and that's been a common theme that I've heard throughout all of the presentations so far. And I will end on a very short video. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. That was amazing. I can feel all your green eyes with envy. How amazing that was. Healthy and getting even healthier. We should put that on a t-shirt. Enjoy your coffee. Please come back for 4 o'clock. Thank you.